I will always have fond memories of my college experience. You know, while some high school students dreamt about going to a big Ivy League school, and I admit, I was curious and yes, I did apply. I actually dreamt about going to the City College of New York, which is one of the flagship schools of the City University of New York. After all, City College was familiar to me. Both my brothers had gone there. When my brother was a pre-med student at the Sophie Davis program, I remember sitting with my brother in the lab on a weekend while he observed lab mice. My brothers had both moved to Harlem to be closer to the college, and I had fond memories of Sunday evenings when we'd all pile into the car and my father would drive them back to Harlem and we would drive through the campus. So yes, a big part of me wanted to have that experience too, because you always kind of want to do what your siblings do. And even though my brothers went to City College in the late 90s, and I went to City College from 2008 to 2012, I don't know that they saw some of the troubling things that I saw. The over-policing of black students on the campus of CUNY schools and being made to feel like you don't belong there by administration and by those enforcing security measures. That's up next on this episode of Race Wars, the Critical Conversations podcast. Hello. Welcome to another episode of Race Wars, the Critical Conversations podcast. And you're here listening with me again, aren't you? If you've made it to episode 4, then that means you just love hearing me talk, and that's fine. But anyway, to understand the role of race in public colleges, and I want to focus specifically on CUNY, you have to understand the history of open enrollment, free tuition, and remedial education at CUNY. And anyone who's ever been a CUNY student or wants to be a CUNY student needs to understand this history. There was a time in our nation's history when Jews were restricted from attending Harvard and other immigrants were struggling financially. It was seen that the only way for upward mobility at this time would be for an education, and the free tuition policy adopted by the City College of New York and CUNY, at that time the City College of New York was called Free Academy. It allowed working class European immigrants to enter into professions such as law and medicine, and it gave them a shot at the middle class. Remember, at this time, City College was, as I mentioned, the Free Academy. And they didn't have a lot of students of color, even though it was right in the middle of Harlem. And while CUNY had educated those groups coming from Europe, the post-World War II immigrants, who were primarily from the American South and the Caribbean, were not given the same treatment. During the 1950s, over 1 million South Blacks and Puerto Ricans settled in New York, many of them not having much education and low skills. And with the job market seeing unskilled jobs on the decline and an increase in white-collar professional and clerical jobs requiring some type of college education, but people of color, black people, and specifically were black people from the South and Puerto Ricans, they struggled to get into CUNY for some of the same reasons that we talk about today. Weak high school preparation from high schools, which prevented them from meeting the upper to middle 80 grade point average required to get into the four-year CUNYs. Even in the 1960s, in the 1950s, it was understood that blacks were getting a significantly inferior education from white people. And in 1968, blacks and Latinos were 25% of the New York City high school graduating class, but only 10% of the city college student body. And this made a lot of people in the community upset. And there were protests demanding that the university reflect the diversity of its community, rightly so. So in 1969, at the height of the civil rights movement, a group of African American and Latino students shut down City College's South Campus. Marches, fires, fistfights, those things horrified the City College community. But these protests led to the introduction of what we call the open admissions policy, which guaranteed every New York City high school graduate a place in CUNY, including the ability to enter the 2-year colleges and transfer to the 4 years. Basically, how the policy worked was that any student with at least an 80 average who ranked in the top 50% of their graduating class was guaranteed a spot at a senior college. And for distinction, the senior colleges are what we call the 4-year institutions. That's your City College, Hunter College, Brooklyn College, City Tech. If I'm missing one, all the 4-year institutions that are CUNY schools. And in addition to open admissions, at that time, CUNY remained free. CUNY also adopted remediation programs to increase the academic success of its students. Open enrollment allowed students who were not prepared for college level work to get remediation classes in the senior colleges. And mind you, remediation was not always an ugly word. In the late 1800s, nearly 80% of universities had remediation programs. But in the late 70s, in New York, there were accusations that CUNY was quote-unquote lowering its standards. So what CUNY did was they implemented what's called a freshman skills assessment test to place students in and out of remedial courses and to verify minimal competency. So if an applicant failed, they enrolled at remedial courses at community colleges. What CUNY also did was that they took remedial courses out of the senior colleges. They did this even though remedial courses were still offered by 78% of U.S. colleges, 81% of public 4-year colleges, and 94% of colleges with minority enrollments surpassing 50%. But CUNY, with a minority enrollment of 65%, would no longer offer remedial courses. And since students of color typically failed these skill tests more than white students, students of color would suffer greatly from the end of remedial courses. But open admission at CUNY really helped to boost the enrollment of students of color at larger rates than ever before. But soon, city and federal politics challenged the open admissions policy. In 1975, President Ford withheld federal aid from New York until it eliminated its open admissions and free tuition. President Ford did not like that one of the largest universities in the world was free. In the 1990s, George Pataki, then governor of New York, And Giuliani, Rudolph Giuliani, you know him, then New York City mayor, had aggressively attacked the CUNY system. They appointed a new CUNY board of trustees in charge of implementing quote-unquote higher standards, all of which were obstacles that negatively impacted minorities and reversed a lot of the gains of open admission. All of this was going on at the same time during the fiscal crisis. But open admission wasn't just affected by the fiscal crisis, but also by what we called white flight in CUNY. White students had left CUNY to attend other institutions because they were more likely to have the resources to afford tuition. Meanwhile, minorities stayed at CUNY. The argument made against open admissions was that not all students are teachable, that government and universities were not equipped to repair the legacy of familiar and societal decay, that well-intentioned public efforts to eliminate inequality and abolish racism are expensive failures, and that higher education can only benefit a talented minority. That was the dialogue back then to justify getting rid of this program. And all of these attacks on CUNY could have only been because CUNY had now become an extremely diverse university filled with students of color. Because as you can see from this history, there seems to be a lot more sympathy and willingness to educate European immigrants in CUNY than there were for immigrants of color. This sudden gatekeeping of the CUNY system, the sudden decline in minority enrollment, and what we're seeing in the present day as tuition goes up and they increasingly, quote-unquote, raise standards, is that a lot of the old white flight is coming back. And you're seeing larger enrollment of white students in the CUNY schools, in the senior colleges. So while CUNY has this amazing history of educating immigrants, there is this history of resistance, where those who are black have had to fight harder to be part of that legacy. And this brings me to the policing at CUNY. About a year after I graduated from City College, I heard about the closing down of the Shakur Community Center. And if you ever attended City College, then you know what I'm talking about. The Morales Shakur Center was named after a member of the Black Liberation Army and Puerto Rican Independence Group, named after two people who are currently living in exile in Cuba. It was a popular student hub. It hosted community events. It was always an autonomous space that served the City College community. It was a safe space. But on October 20th, 2013, NYPD officers and CUNY security marched in unannounced, put the campus on lockdown, seized files and personal property, and forced students out of the center and closed it down forever. And when I think about that, I think about the ways in which the place where I went to school was over-policed. And you only really understand how bad something is when you experience something different. So I compare my experiences as a student at a CUNY school that was extremely diverse to a private university which was not as diverse. And as a CUNY student, I remember I had to show my ID everywhere. Any building on campus required you to show ID. There's a security guard at a post everywhere, watching you as you walk in the building. Show ID. Don't have ID? Go home or go to the administration building and get a copy of your program. Even to go into the library, which was in the building itself, the NAC, you had to show ID. even though you already had to show ID to get into the NAC building. Even if you walked into the building, walked out, and then walked back in 3 seconds later and had the same security guard, you had to show them ID over and over and over again. Meanwhile, at the private university, anybody could walk on the campus. As a matter of fact, this became a problem because there was somebody walking around stealing student laptops from the library. But you could essentially walk into any building with no problem, no questions. You never had to justify your presence. And I'll tell you one thing that really bothered me as a CUNY student. As much as I love the City College of New York, and I love the education I got there, and I love the people who I met there, I'll tell you one story. I was doing LSAT tutoring at the time, and it required me to go to the school on Sundays because I think at the time it was like my only availability. Would you believe that I had to convince security that I was going to school for LSAT tutoring? They were trying to tell me, campus is closed, that I should go home, and what type of person goes to school on Sunday anyway? What they think I was trying to get into the building to do, steal? I remember security used to escort me directly to the tutoring classroom to be sure that that's exactly where I was going. That's how much they did not believe me. And it bothered me that it was such a big deal. And in some ways, I was treated like a criminal just for going to LSAT tutoring. Meanwhile, when I was in law school, all the classrooms were open to study. You could go anywhere, you could study anywhere, you could do anything on any day, even on a Sunday. And I remember being stunned that the campus was open on Sunday because I was not used to that. I was used to on the weekends. If you've ever passed through the campus at City College of New York, everything is locked up. Like they're expecting somebody to come in and bulldoze the place. Everything is just locked up tight. But that was the experience. And that's what I want you to know. I wanted you to know this comparison and how different it is. And how, even if you're skeptical, you probably think that some of that had to do with race. That some of that, there's little too much of a coincidence that one place had a lot of white students, one place had a lot of black students. The difference in how people are treated and how the campus is treated. I mean, we had police at the university where I went in Boston, but you didn't really see them unless you needed them. I'd always heard of what we call the BU police, but rarely saw them. When I was a CUNY student, oh man, security, police, everywhere, all the time, can't escape it, can't avoid it. Well, when we come back, I have a special interview on this episode of Race Wars, the Critical Conversations podcast. We're going to take a brief break on Race Wars, the Critical Conversations podcast, and then I will have with me Tafadar, who will be my special guest on this episode. Tune in because we have a very, very interesting, intriguing, and critical conversation coming up right now. Hey, lovely listeners. This is Mike here. It is my hope and desire that you are truly enjoying this podcast. I want this experience to be as interactive as possible. So if you have a question or a response to anything that you've heard on this episode, send me an email at theracewarspodcast@gmail.com or send me a DM on my official Instagram account for this podcast and follow us at _race_wars_podcast. Interact with me also on Facebook at facebook.com/theracewarspodcast. Let's talk. I'll be waiting for you. I want to take this time to shout out some local businesses and creatives. As I've stated on my social media, if you are creative or running a business, please let me know. I would be happy to shout you out on this podcast. The only thing that I ask is that you share this podcast with your friends and the people who support your ventures. So I'm going to once again take the opportunity to shout out some of my personal favorite creatives who I know, but please, people, spread the word. First, I want to encourage everyone, please check out Dreatorials that Andrea Laris is posting to her YouTube account. She's been doing some wonderful makeup tutorials. She's new in the game, and her videos continue to intrigue. Her YouTube channel is Drea Rodriguez, and you can find her by searching for her Dreatorials on YouTube. That is Dreatorials. I want to also show love to my boy Kashim Brown, who is the owner of Emprise One, and all the incredible work that he has been doing to help me with the editing of this podcast. No task is too small for this guy. Check him out at kbrown@emprise.one. That is KBROWN at Emprise, EMPRISE.1. Finally, my boy based in Boston, Michael Acasio with Mako Photography, personally one of my favorite photographers in the city of Boston. Please check out his work at Mako_photography on Instagram for all your photography needs. That is at MACO_photography. And that is all. Thank you. Welcome back to Race Wars, the Critical Conversations podcast. And I'm here with Tafadar. He is a student and community organizer who focuses on labor organizing in construction, and also a fellow City College alum. And I figured he would be the perfect person to talk to about this issue of over-policing and race in the City College and CUNY community, because I really think he has some very interesting experiences. So how are you doing today?
I'm doing good, Mike. Thanks for having me on here.
It's great to have you. And one of the things that I was talking about earlier in the podcast is a lot about my experiences and how I found that there was just too much security on campus and you have to show your ID everywhere. I don't know if you remember, even if you leave a building and come back 2-3 seconds later, you have to show your ID again. And it's just, I compared that to my experience going to a private university for law school and how the campus was just open. Like we had police, but you never saw them unless you needed them or you called them. And one story I can remember is it even caused some people to get their laptops stolen because the campus is so open that people can just walk around anywhere. The one major difference that I noticed was that it was a much whiter campus than the campus that we came from, the community we came from. So, you know, what did you remember seeing in your experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I was always organizing on campus, and for some of the organizing that we did, the school tried to kick us out, and they started like a court proceedings against us to put an end to our movement. So, I had a pretty unique view for the last couple of years of my education at City College, where security, they knew me by name, they knew me by face, I'll get followed around campus. So I had that view as an activist. But of course, just like also being just a student there and knowing people and observing things, you also see how this is a lot of, negative interactions between the security establishment of City College and the students. And I think that goes to, it has you can trace a direct line from the way that City College treats students generally and its activists in particular to a lot of the policies that, exclude working class communities of color in the university. Our college in particular is a landmark for civil rights victories and opening up public higher education to poor Black and brown people. And some of the security practices that we have on campuses trace directly back to preventing, similar protests. Like they were created with that in mind.
And I remember someone had said, and I believe this is true, that the NAC building was actually designed intentionally to resist protest.
Yeah, I can't confirm the exact facts of that, but I've definitely heard that a lot too. And having been a protest leader on campus, it is an effective design to contain and prevent protests, which we found ways to circumvent that. But it's it's the entire thing is designed to corral student activism, and it's beyond just student activism, right? It's also like community activism. Being the public college in Harlem, like that means something, and for that to be removed more and more from the people every year since open admissions was ended by the board of trustees, and you see the gentrification of the university with the gentrification of the community around it, then suddenly the security and the policing practices begin to make sense, because they're ultimately like these universities, they're becoming more and more real estate operations with education as a secondary thing, right? And they really need to protect that. Like the perfect example is right around the corner, Columbia University. It's a very big landlord, and they're gentrifying Harlem, and knocking they're pushing projects out of their way in order to build their dormitories and condos. You can look at other schools too, like Fordham University, NYU, especially the private universities. They're big landlords, and CUNY as a system is trying to become competitive in that way by magnifying their capital interests over their actual social purpose, right?
Right.
And in trying to become like Columbia and NYU, they're also, joining the game and the race to gentrify and become an institution of that sort. So once you start thinking about it that way and seeing these property relations and these, profitability streams, suddenly the policing aspect of it starts to make sense, because at the end of the day, policing is about protecting property, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've been reading this book, The End of Policing, and I'm sure you've heard of it. And it talks all about that, hey, the biggest myth is that policing is actually there to protect people. That is the biggest myth. That's not what they're there for. They're there to protect the interests of the higher classes and their interests alone, and to maintain and contain poor communities, particularly communities of color. That's the function of the police.
Right. And I think, especially in New York City, when we, we're talking about CUNY, and it's a perfect, place to start talking about policing, because CUNY is a public utility, right? It's something that belongs to the people of New York. And it's something that the people of New York, as the population diversified and became more, black and brown communities, or as I like to refer to, oppressed nationalities, which back in the 60s and the 70s, when we fought all those civil rights battles, the activists that came before us, the oppressed nationalities were primarily African American and Puerto Rican in the city.
Right.
And that's changed in a lot of ways since then. But, in the 60s and the 70s, looking at, the economy and property, there was a very major thing that happened, and it was called the 1970s fiscal crisis. That's when CUNY first began to charge tuition, right? During the fiscal crisis. I forget the exact year. I believe it was the mid-1970s.
Yeah, that sounds correct.
But so during that fiscal crisis, New York City went broke, and they appointed like a board of private capitalists to restructure the entire cities. And that was like basically the birth of neoliberal New York City. And ever since then, they've been using, Wall Street debt to finance the entire city's economy. And because financial capital through that means has gained such a hold over our institutions and our, city budget and other things, we've been seeing over the decades the degradation of public housing, the degradation of public education, the degradation of public transportation, while their profits soar as like their different firms hold, they own the bonds and the stakes in these utilities that should be serving the people. And there we can begin to touch on, something that you can see widespread, not just in our city, but everywhere really, the role of financial capital and how it preys on cities and towns and, eats up our budgets and our, cash-strapped cities. They usually turn to the private sector and to private finance in order to raise capital to deal with immediate problems. And that creates, generational problems of debt. And it creates a feedback loop, a doom loop that, it gets passed down to the future. Like the MTA right now can barely, even before Corona, right? It could barely function. And that's because of there's a gigantic black hole of Wall Street debt that's built into the NCA budget that's been being passed down ever since the 80s when they redeveloped it to the 90s when they refinanced it and so on and so on. So the role of the police really kicks in there. It's not it's not even just to protect like small mom and pop shops and whatever, but it's not even to protect property directly. It's to protect that order of power where financial capital dominates everything that is private and public in the life of our cities and in our country in general too, right?
Yeah.
And that's where we can, I think that's the big context in which we have to understand policing in the community and on campus. Like when the communities financialize capital, once they control entire cities, they just look at cities as like different zones of like real estate opportunities, right? Bloomberg and Giuliani's whole thing was launching that. De Blasio has continued it, and they're doing it through the rezonings currently. And that involves, obviously over policing certain neighborhoods. And, there are real public safety issues in our neighborhoods. Like we do have criminal elements amongst our own people who prey on our people.
Right.
And, at the end of the day, the way I see it is that regular people trying to live their lives get stuck between the state and its agents and, these elements that prey on their own people and whatever networks and associations that they have, and the war that often starts between them and the state, the war between them and each other. So for me, the question is, sorry, there's some music playing outside.
No, it's okay.
Like the question I try to think about is, in fighting against like the order that the police protect, the order of like financial like they call it law and order, right? But it's really an order of financial capital dominating everything else. If we want to figure out, like, if we keep talking about defund the police and abolish the police, as movement goals, realistically, you're never going to legislate the police away by decree. They are armed bands of, state agents. And at the end of the day, you can never legislate that away. You can't legislate that kind of power away. Right. And secondly, when it comes to defunding, and I'm very critical of that too, because they can beat you up and kill you with $8 billion the same way they can do with $10 billion, right?
Very true.
I think we have to figure out how to alter the relations of power. And when it comes to that, it's about building a mass movement against the core features of the system that the police protect, and not just targeting the police alone. And, I think a hyper focus on that is one of the issues of this movement that we recently just had around City Hall, where it dissipated without even being able to achieve its own aims. And, in the times that we're living in with fascism rising and, armed vigilantes and cooperating with the state, we can't afford for our movements to just like navigate their own idealisms. We have to be very more precise in our strategies and tactics now and really go for wins. And that means analyzing what goes wrong and what the ideas are behind, that drive the things that go wrong in our movements. So to get back to, from the big picture, I think what that looks like concretely and looking at the history of everything that I just talked about and the relationship of finance to our financial capital, to our communities and to our institutions and to our economy, what we need in order to fight not just the police, but the order of poverty, that everything that we've just been discussing, and the things that maintain it, we need a broad, general working class front that fights, we need to unite the movements that are fighting for public housing, that are fighting for equitable and fair public transit, that are fighting for good jobs, that are fighting for, public higher education, like we fought for many years in CUNY, and students are still fighting for. Like all these movements need to come together under the banner of a working class platform. And I think, we had something that really looked like that while Bernie Sanders' campaign was still in full swing. And it's never too late to like develop something like that, right? But I think we really need clear analysis behind movement building in order to push it in a direction where we can win. Because right now you do have all these different movements, but movements sit in their silos and go off in different ways and don't unite in the right way. And I think a lot of that has to do with not understanding, who are our friends and who are our enemies. I'm rambling a little bit, so feel free to.
No, you're absolutely correct, and I do think that there's so much about that is true. And how do we unite these movements and show these movements that they need each other? Not only that they need each other, but that they're working towards the same goals maybe the subjects are a little bit different, but they're really working towards the same goals, and that one thing is going to help the other. And it's like, how do you get movements to see that and to sort of focus that message more? Because a lot of this has to do with message, right? I mean, how do
Right.
we get a unified front and a unified message together so that the people, the working class, can be stronger when they're, when they're protesting and when they're going out and they're calling for change? Because when you think about something like defund the police, I think a lot of people are so confused about what that's supposed to mean, what the implications are, and everybody has their own definition. But who's supposed to carry the message? Who's supposed to run the movement at the end of the day? Who's
Mhm.
supposed to be the figurehead?
Right. Yeah, I think like building that kind of like united working class front, because it's got to be a front of many different movements, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's 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 a long and difficult thing, and it's something that I've just me personally, I've been doing this for like 10 years and trying to build something like that. And I think the times we're living in, they're scary and they're terrible, but more and more people are, and I hate to use this word, awake more than ever before,
Right.
and thinking and really like have a desire to change the world. And while that's going on, time is not our friend, just because we have probably the most important election of our lifetimes, just a few months away, and our forces aren't strong enough, and our movements aren't, built up enough, strong as they are, and as many wins as we have been gaining. But I think what is critical, what is very critical here, is we have to look at the composition of our movements, right?
Mm-hmm.
So having organized in the left for many years, you have to look at like what is the makeup of the movement, right? And you have a lot of like artists and students, academics, people who are staff in like NGOs and members of community organizations here and there, and all those aspects are very important. But at the end of the day, what you need to really alter power in a society is the ability to fuck with money, right?
Mm-hmm.
You got to be able to stop the flow of money. You got to be able to strike at the economy. You got to be able to stop the production of needs and wants, because that also stops the production of profits for the people who control the production of needs and wants. And basically what I'm saying, you have to harness the power of labor to be able to strike for political goals. This is something that, in the Marxist tradition, it's discussed as turning the economic strike into a political strike. And that means harnessing the power of the working class. And that's exactly why I myself and other people who used to organize in CUNY and, we still organize in the communities, we went into labor unions to organize there, to fight alongside and on behalf of, workers directly in production and earn the kind of leadership needed to shift the direct consciousness of workers in production towards a bigger picture and bringing, people together. Like, we organize construction workers, and it's a very wide industry. You have a lot of Italians and Irish folk, and, race-wise, it's very complicated. I'm going to leave it at that. But at the same time, with that mass of people, we've got conservative white construction workers fighting alongside undocumented construction workers, because when it comes to benefits, suddenly we're all in the same boat and we're forced to work together. And, when you have a movement space like that, it allows people to like come to, a reckoning with their own chauvinisms and whatever. But the point I'm trying to get at is that the space of trade union organizing, I think, is critical in order to bring together the kind of working class coalition that you need,
right,
to confront, these powerful forces of capital that have billions of dollars and, militaries and
Hello?
at their behest. And, I think a lot of people are like awakening to that too. Like, ever since Trump got elected, there's more talk about like general strikes, and unions are more popular than ever before. It's definitely there in the consciousness of society. It's just about people putting in the work to bring together, the actual force. Like, you have to create it, right? You can't just theorize it. This was one of Marx's greatest points, and I think my favorite quote from him. He said, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm honestly very curious about how you managed to get, the Italian and the Irish Americans to sort of work together with the undocumented interests, immigrants for the same goal,
Hmm.
because race is all over that, and
Hmm.
you wouldn't be surprised that a lot of these Irish and Italian Americans, they're living in their neighborhoods and they're voting for Trump, or they're getting ready to vote for Trump. How do you
Yep.
get them to sort of unite under this front, especially when, I mean, let's be honest, the history of construction and unions
Hmm.
are keeping certain people out and having certain
Hmm.
people in.
Yeah. Yep. So I mean, I think that in the course of like capitalism doing its thing and in its boom and bust cycles, like every boom and bust cycle of capitalism creates more misery for the workers, right?
Hmm.
And it enriches the rich even more. We've seen that after 2008, so it after the 90s, after the 70s, Great Depression, every single cycle of it, you can see a lot of the workers gets worse. And, capitalism reaches its breaking points. And, the last time it reached some major breaking points, we saw world wars. This time, when it started to crack, we saw the rise of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump.
Right.
Unfortunately, one was able to win out and the other wasn't. Um, and I think that as the system takes its course, the system grows more vicious, but it also grows weaker, and that creates room for things like that to happen.
Hmm.
Construction workers, aren't dumb. They're able to see, all right, I like Trump, I don't like immigrants, but these immigrants are fighting for the same thing as me, and if I don't fight alongside them, I'm fucked.
Right.
Like when it comes to like fighting over concrete things, like it's one thing to be fighting over like grand social goals and policy initiatives and ideas. It's another thing when you're fighting over your wages and your benefits, your bread and your butter. It's like it's the food in your mouth. It's what's taking your kid to the doctor, having health insurance.
Hmm.
And when it comes to fighting for those things, people are really forced to think about what do you prioritize more, the things that you've been raised to believe or the things that are right in front of your face.
Yeah.
And, more often than not, workers will make the right decision. That's not to say that that's always the case, but when it comes to fighting for people, people's livelihoods, the context of things gets really transformed. The consciousness of people transforms more easier. And that's not to say, things come out perfect, but it's definitely, like for me coming out of university organizing and thinking about race relations in one way and then going into the working class and organizing directly there as a worker myself, um, you start to, see that people are complex beings and you really have to understand how to transform people and then turn that into a general strategy. And, I think it comes down to people are complex beings with good and bad in them. And if a good organizer has to figure out how to draw out the good in as many people as possible.
Hmm.
And we did that. We fought one of the richest developers on earth together on the world, Steve Ross over at the Hudson Yards, and that really created like an atmosphere of solidarity amongst construction workers in the union construction world in New York City. And us having been leaders in that struggle, we were able to then like use the influence that and the respect and trust that we had earned amongst the construction workforce to just simply point out, hey, why don't we expand our conception of solidarity? The fundamental, essential driving thing of trade unionism is solidarity. Why don't we expand that to not just ourselves, but to these folks who rightfully deserve a union? And at that point, it's like people are really forced to wonder. It's like, oh, I don't want these people around. Wait, why is that? Am I, it really forces people to think, am I a racist? Am I against my own union for this? And people transform in that way.
Yeah. And these things that people learn when they're growing up can be unlearned. I think that's the one thing we forget so much, is that these biases and this racism and these crazy thoughts that people have about other people, those things can be unlearned. if people just give themselves the opportunity to be open, to grow, and are put in the right circumstances.
Right, right. And sometimes, sometimes people aren't going to unlearn them. And even despite that, they'll be willing to work together. And I think that's another thing that, our movements have to learn is to not to compromise on our principles, but when it comes to, building a united front against the people with the fucking money and the power, we do have to learn how to compromise to like build a wide working class coalition. Because the working class is, it's diverse. It has there are liberal workers, there are conservative workers. People are on a different spectrum, right? But we have to learn how to, you have to learn how to live with. We might get 1 million people together to fight for the MTA to be funded, and maybe some of those people will be racists. But if we win the struggle afterwards, the overwhelming majority that is not racist will be in a better position to unite even more people and transform the consciousnesses of even more people. And in that way, like minimizing the ability of, racist ideas and whatever to be influential in the world.
With everything, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we can't, especially when you have youth-based movements, there's a lot of like impatience, but we can't change the world overnight. We have to think in terms of long-term operational strategy.
Yeah, you're right. And we forget that a lot. One thing that I am very curious about is with everything going on with Corona, where do you see organizing within the CUNY system in the future or even now? What are we're in a very interesting circumstance right now. What are the students going to do? I mean, think about tuition, for example. People are still going to have to pay the same tuition for sitting behind a computer and taking a course. Something maybe should be done about that. And how are students going to take back their campuses with everything going on with the coronavirus?
So I think we have to think about it in light of the larger issue to begin with, the larger issue of like CUNY being displaced from the communities of this city, which by that specifically, I mean the trend over the last 2 decades of Black and brown people being working class people in Black and brown communities being systematically excluded from the institution of CUNY. Like when I organized the CUNY, right, one thing that we cautioned ourselves against was thinking of it as a student struggle. We saw ourselves as, leaders that had emerged from oppressed communities that were being excluded from our democratic right to higher education to free public higher education. And we saw the struggle in the university as a struggle to open it up to our communities. So that was, our guiding thing. So when people would fight for narrow student-centric demands, you would be like, okay, like, of course, we'll support you in your struggle for like whatever it is you want, like free printing or whatever, these campus-based issues. But if that's in the context of not also fighting to open up the university to the communities that it's excluding, then all we would realistically end up doing is creating a more comfortable university experience for, people who are able to access it, people who are able to access it because of gentrification, right?
Right.
So I think when we're thinking about the impact of COVID and what we have to do in the universities, we also have to, it's inextricably linked to the question of how is this going to affect all the students that go to public school in New York City being able to go into a CUNY? Right. I think that's the first thing to consider, and that the CUNY student movement, like, it's difficult, right? You're asking people to think about something that is completely apart from their interests. Like, I come out of also the high school student movement, so just to put that there. So I think about that also, but if we're not thinking about how to deal with the fact that a lot of young kids coming out of high school are not going to be able to have any sort of college experience now because CUNY was already the only shot that a lot of people from poor neighborhoods had at getting a college education.
Right.
Like, that's going to be totally out of whack now because of everything that's happened. And, that I think has to be the first consideration. And if that isn't fought for, then we could make whatever procedural changes to education, but the battle's lost before it's even been won, because it's not the people's university anymore, because the very people it was created to serve have been excluded out of it, and this crisis will lead to a sort of disaster capitalism where the powers that be, namely the board of trustees and the state legislature, et cetera, they exacerbate the neoliberalization of our university even further. Now, that being said, when it comes to fighting for education in the era of COVID, it's difficult, right? They're laying off a lot of adjuncts and whatever to save on costs. And even if say like CUNY, let's say CUNY had full funding right now, which is the other big problem, right? If CUNY had full funding, then we would still be facing a lot of issues of like layoffs and like changes to education and whatever, just because the nature, like if the nature of the job, right? Like if you're an adjunct, if let's say I'm a professor, if you have 2 professors and 10 adjuncts in a hypothetical educational setting, right? And suddenly there's COVID, and let's say those 2 professors are tenured, but suddenly from like a business perspective, right? The management of the university is going to look and think, do we really need 10 adjuncts if this is the case? And you could make an argument that you do in order to provide quality education to people and like tend to all the new challenges and everything, right? But they don't think like us. They think like a business, and that is inevitably going to lead to a slashing of the workforce and automation of certain aspects of it, and that's difficult. Like the teachers are fighting, the PSC, they've been fighting to prevent that, but it all goes back to the bigger problem of the thing that's weighing above all of our struggles right now. Whether it's about, funding for public housing, funding for public education, and preventing the things that'll hurt our education, funding for the MTA, the need for a bailout for New York right now. Like if we don't get a $60 billion package, then every aspect of everything is fucked.
Right.
And, as activists, we tend to fight against the de Blasios and the Cuomos, but they're little fish compared to the guy in the White House,
right, or
the institution of the White House in general. And, all the cuts and stuff that they're going to force on us, it's under the shadow of the fact that there's this gigantic hole, a black hole in our municipal budget and our state budget that was already there, and now it's exploding because of Corona. And I think, like going back to what we were talking about earlier, it's like if we want to unite all the movements and if we want to solve the problems that are going to, or take significant steps towards making progress on solving the problems that are going to exist for students on campuses, a people's bailout is a must.
Right.
And for New York, it's like, we went through fucking 9/11. We got hit hardest by Corona, and it's sociopathic not to be trying to save us on that basis alone, but also like we're like one of the nerve centers of the U.S. economy. So, this guy in the White House who talks about make America great again and the left is destroying America is like actually destroying America, right? But I'm fighting for that.
You can't have a strong America without a strong New York.
Yeah, exactly. This empire cannot survive without New York. And, right now, that's like, in my opinion, that's the biggest thing. Like we had a construction workers rally at City Hall of like progressive and radical construction workers while the occupation was still going on, where we were calling for a bailout. A lot of our unions like are officially calling for like a bailout for New York in the next coronavirus package. And it's, without it, we're headed into like, they're already trying to do 22,000 layoffs of city workers because the money just doesn't exist. They're already trying to force concessions from our unions, from like public sector unions and other places, and, take it out of our wages and our benefits and force us to make the compromises as workers. And it's all because the threat of this of no bailout is being held over our heads. And, I don't, it's crazy. We're all like starting to resume our lives. I'm looking out the window right now and people are playing and walking around. We were traumatized by what happened and people are really trying to take steps back towards normal life. but there's a fucking meteor coming our way. If
Oh
by
yeah.
October we don't get that bailout,
Oh yeah.
it's like the meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs, right?
Yeah. I don't think people understand. I mean, I know that a lot of it is a mental thing. People want to,
Hmm.
their mentality is they want to get back to normal, so they're trying to act like it to give themselves
Right.
a sense of normalcy. But we can't get lost in trying to get back to real life and forgetting the big meteor that's coming if something doesn't happen.
Right. And that's where I think CUNY students have a special role. We've always had a special role, right? Whether it was standing up against war, standing up against fascism, standing in support of liberation movements like South Africa, fighting for the community to have access to education, fighting against tuition. Like in times when the national student movement was like non-existent or in a super downturn, CUNY fucking held it down because CUNY students are badass. Because first of all, we're New Yorkers. Second
Mm-hmm.
of all, you know, CUNY students struggle. We're a university of people who struggle to make it through life,
Mm-hmm.
and we know what it means to fight, right? So I think CUNY students have a special role in fighting for things like this, and that CUNY students should be forming coalitions and, gathering all the clubs together. Like the University Student Senate should be bringing people together. All the forces that can be united in the university should take a lead in, fighting on behalf of all of New York. And if that means, 100,000, 1,000 CUNY students or whatever going to the federal building, and camping out and demanding a bailout, and if that's what it takes to like spark off a movement like that, that's the wavelength that we've got to be on. And part of it is, and I'm gonna really let loose here. People in the university, everywhere you look right now, politicians, corporations, everyone's trying to have the activist look, right?
Mm-hmm.
And our university produces a lot of. Sorry, let me turn this up.
Yeah, no
Sorry.
worries, no
Yeah,
worries.
our university produces a lot of folks who go into activism, and our overwhelming majority are great people, right? Who really do want to change the world. But institutionally, there's the reproduction of like what I call resume activism. That has to go completely, and the student movement has to start getting its hands dirty
Yeah.
and really go out there and really fight. Like, you're gonna get arrested, go do it. You're gonna go camp, you're gonna go camp out at the federal building or wherever, find a viable target and present your demands, go do it. Like, now is the time to really step it up, to fight like we're at war, because we are.
Right.
There's a fascist in the White House who's trying to destroy our city while telling, sleepers and literal domestic terrorists to go out and carry out violence for his cause. Now, like, we're literally at war, and the economic side of that war is gonna eclipse the other sides of that war very soon. And CUNY students should be out there. We should be fighting, and we can't wait for anybody. As a union member, I'll say it too. They can't wait for the unions to fight. Like in history, always students and youth have to lead by example and hold that mirror up to society to force it to face its own ugly, to galvanize the rest of society to just stand up and put an end to what it is we don't like.
Yeah. My concern, though, with all of this being said, is how do we get people to pay attention? You know why? Because there's a big misinformation campaign going on, and all these platforms that we use to spread awareness, to mobilize people, these platforms are being taken over by the misinformation machine that is telling people mixed messages, that's telling them things that are not true. And if people don't go out and do their research, they're going to fall for anything. And they're not going to understand the important implications of what's really going on. So how do we keep people engaged? How do we get them to pay attention? I mean, you mentioned that you were part of the high school activist group. I would love to see high school students nowadays getting more and more involved, but they're hooked on the Facebook and Instagram and the TikTok in a way that's different from when we were in high school and when we were in undergrad. It's harder and harder to get people to pay attention with all the distractions and with all the, QAnon and all the crazy stuff that we're seeing online. that is disguised as trying to wake people up, but is actually kicking them back to sleep.
Mm. Right. Yeah, I think we might have to rethink a lot of things there because it was kids that shut down a Trump rally by using TikTok to encourage to get people to buy up the tickets, right?
That's true.
And these kids are like, it's interesting how like TikTok has become such a controversy in the international business world because of that. And I think we really have to challenge a lot of our own ideas and learn from the youth and what they're innovating. Like I was out on the streets protesting when the George Floyd's protest started, and as somebody who led massive protests before, I I was there just learning from these kids that are doing it now and watching them learn in the process too. And I think the Gen Zers, the younger ones, I think that's what you call them, right? Gen Z.
I think, yeah.
They they I'm like the last year of millennials, so I guess I was born in '94. So I guess after us, they're all Gen Z. Um,
Yeah, I can't keep track of all the titles.
yeah, but I think they're a really activist generation. Like when I was out there in the protests, all you see is like thousands and thousands. Like there was one in particular. We marched to Foley Square, and those of us that were in the front, we went up to the court steps, and everywhere you saw it, I couldn't even see an empty street. It was just young people everywhere, of all colors, right? On their phones, blah blah blah. If you look on social media now, it's like it's commonplace to see things about like young people talking about socialism or saying justice for Breonna Taylor or just like sharing cat memes, and then right after that something about society and structural racism, blah blah blah. It's there. I think people are paying attention more than ever. I think the only question is how to harness it, and
Yeah.
there is how the protest broke out for after George Floyd was executed. That I think was a very special circumstance, right? I don't think any one organization or movement of people can spark something like that because we were all locked up at home for months and people were already outraged. And, the adults were all still at home, so all the kids went out and we did our thing, right?
Right.
But the things that have come out of it, I think that's important to pay attention to. And, we were just touching on some of that with like the differences we notice in like how people talk about things on social media and whatever. Of course, that's not enough. Like, I mean, personally, I don't like the internet when it comes to organizing. That's one thing I like about being a union organizer. I can rely on a human information system of people based on their job sites and their relationships to each other to spread the word about like if we have an action or a rally or something, and not just relying on the internet. I think it really stunts a lot of movement building. But at the same time, I'm trying to learn from like how these young people do it and adapt that to my own organizing. And I think conversely, they also have a lot to learn about how to organize without the internet. And how that looks like, I think, is you got to go into the community. Like, you got to physically interface with people. When I was organizing in CUNY, what we would do during the summer when school was out, the student movement wouldn't stop for us. We would go into the community and like there was an organization in Harlem called Picture the Homeless by 125th and Lex. We would help them. They were a homeless-led organization. We would get flyers from them and go out throughout the city whenever like the DAs would do like the summons forgiveness things, and we would go to like where homeless people concentrate and pass that out, to give them the information they might need to go get their summonses cleared if that's something they're trying to do. We would be organizing against gentrification in the Bronx. We'd be doing organizing to cleanups and stuff in Queens. You got to doing these things, you're able to interface with people and talk to them, and in real time start challenging the disinformation that's out there intentionally, right? There's like billions of dollars being thrown out to purposely spread disinformation. And of course, to really make a dent, that has to be on a wide scale. But that's why like I'm specifically mentioning institutions like the University Student Senate and others that have the capacity to, lead that sort of wide scale effort, instead of, doing like what careerist Democrats do, which is doing like minuscule activism and that looks nice on social media to boost one's own self-interest. Like you really got to stand up to the powers.
Yeah. There's too much of that resume activism going on.
Yeah, right. It's like if if the USS, organized something where CUNY students went into every neighborhood in New York City, even in the outer boroughs, wherever, and I don't know, like set up a table or something, every weekend, give out coffee, food, whatever, and register people to vote, yeah, sure, but other stuff too, whatever you can, even something like that, something as basic as that would create the network that you needed to mobilize for sharper points of struggle, like if they try to do a fair hike on the MTA or something like that. There's, for me, I'm like a practical solution-oriented person. So I'm always trying to think of concrete things that can be organized with actual people into, actual efforts. And I think that that's exactly what CUNY needs right now, that kind of leadership. Student government can no longer be about padding one's own resume. Student government has to become about mobilizing for the freedom struggle now. Unfortunately, that's not the case. There's some great people that go into student government that are in there, that come out of there, but by and large, it's just not the case anymore. Not like it used to be back in the day, like way back in the day.
Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you something that really frustrated me when I was in law school in particular is you have your bosses and your losses, and you have your student government, and you have your diversity groups. And unfortunately, you don't see enough real activism. You see a lot of resume padding. You see people want to lead these organizations so they could say they did it, so they could get a job at a firm or something. But you don't see them really, really seriously helping students, in helping the institutions and challenging them where they need to be challenged. I think there's a little more of that now, but in my personal experience, I did not see enough challenging of the administration and of the institution on a real practical basis. Not just trying to get people jobs and I mean, jobs are important, but
right.
You have to also think big picture when you're thinking about society and how do we fight against these institutions. And you know what? The academic institutions are bad too. They are no different from corporations. They are corporations in some ways.
Yeah, and they reproduce the ideology that maintains like the whole order of things, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So they're preparing the future agents of the system.
Right.
And that's what makes something like a CUNY special, right? It's like if you're thinking about like a Yale, Harvard, like these big institutions of education, they're like just straight up preparing the children of the ruling class to become the future ruling class. But in CUNY, you have like, working class people, and that's why these radical politics are able to develop. Like I just tagged you in something actually that just came to mind I'd seen earlier today. But the CUNY graduate, Jamel Henderson, who graduated from Brooklyn College, is organizing a emergency rally at Barclay Center tomorrow at 6 p.m. In solidarity with CUNY students that were brutalized at a Daniel Prude protest. I believe it's the one where the car drove into people.
Yes.
So, so I just remembered it and I'm bringing it up because that's an example of like everything that I was just talking about. And when it comes to things like that, I think it's important to concentrate efforts into making those things successful to keep momentum going. So, if anybody's listening, I would encourage them to go out tomorrow, September 9th at 6 p.m. At Barclay Center and stand with the CUNY students that are organizing here locally against racial genocide.
Yeah, definitely. Really important issues that we touched on today. And I want to thank you once again for coming on. And, I knew that this conversation was going to be really fulfilling. So once again, I appreciate you coming on and talking. And thank you so much.
Definitely. Thanks for having me, Mike.
Yes, of course.
All right. Well, I would urge people to follow on Facebook, Building Trades for Workers' Democracy, which is a page that, espouses the views of the progressive section of the construction workers movement.
Interesting. Definitely. I would encourage people to do that. Is there anything else that you want people to check out? You think that they should read or look at, or what else is out
Yeah,
there?
I think the I would encourage people to read up on a topic rather than like any specific book or resource or whatever. Read up on predatory finance and the financialization of the U.S. economy, because that is one of the missing links in the thinking of the left, and that is what ties together a lot of analysis around neoliberalism and policing and poverty and education and other public services. We have to understand the role that these banks and hedge funds that sit on Wall Street, the exact ways in which they dominate us. Because if you don't understand how your opponent is attacking you, how can you launch a defense and then an offense to stop them, right?
Very true. Very, very true.
Yeah, predatory finance. That's the thing we have to understand. And the FIRE economy, that's finance, insurance, and real estate. And, if anybody has any questions, because it's a pretty big topic and I could go on about this stuff forever, I would, also invite people to email me at TSOUROV, like Victor, 00 @gmail.com.
Perfect. Yeah, I would encourage people, please email him with any questions. And as always, email me with any questions that you have about this episode. Thank you so much once again.
Definitely, brother. Thank you, and have a good day. Stay safe.
You too. Stay safe.
Bye.
And there we have it. I want to thank Tafadar once again for joining me on this episode of Race Wars. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in. I hope that you learned a great deal about what's going on, especially regarding CUNY and racism and organizing and all of these different layers of the things that are happening out there in the world. Don't forget, pay attention. Do not get lost in the sauce, right? And as I've said before, if you have any questions about anything that you've heard on this episode, or you want to contact me, you want to reach out to me, don't forget the Race Wars Podcast at gmail.com is where you go. That is the Race Wars Podcast at gmail.com is where you go. And I'll talk to you again on the next episode. And don't forget, if nobody else is proud of you, what do I say? I'm proud of you. Thank you so much for tuning in. God bless.